Okay, so how do we know that these two systems, short-term and long-term memory, are separate and distinct? One way is to test memory performance. Differential performance on memorization tests reveals a distinction between short-term and long-term memory. The effect is called the serial position curve or the serial position effect. Through this curve, we can also understand one way in which information is transferred from short-term to long-term memory. Let's start out with the test. As a participant, you would be given a word list like this one to memorize. And so it's important to think about how the average person would approach this task. Most people use rote repetition rehearsal. They repeat the words as many times as they can during the time that they're given. Just like you would repeat the phone number over and over again as you are walking from one room to the next, if you don't want to forget it. So usually most people start out at the top and then add one word with each repetition. So they would say dog, clock, chair. Dog, clock, chair, moon. Dog, clock, chair, moon, cat. Dog, clock, chair, moon, cat, book. Right? And they would repeat this over and over again and keep going down the list until they got to the end. And so what this means is that some words receive more repetition than others. And so this is the explanation for performance for this first part of the serial position curve. So after they attempt to memorize all the words on the list, they are then given a free recall test. So they are given a blank piece of paper and they're asked to write down as many words as they can remember from the list. The serial position curve is the recall performance based on the position of the word on the list. So this y-axis is the performance, so the likelihood that the word is remembered, and the x-axis is the word's position on the list. So where was that word positioned on the list that was given to participants? And so what we see is facilitated performance for words at the beginning of the list. And so this is referred to as the primacy effect. And it's believed to be dependent upon long-term memory. And so the idea is that with more repetitions, information is able to be transferred from short-term to long-term memory. And so we have facilitated performance for these words at the beginning of the list because they have been transferred to long-term memory. And so that long-term memory is facilitating performance. So the idea is that if we had this list before, we are repeating dog, clock, chair a lot more frequently than we are other words on the list. And so we're having better recall performance for those words. We also see facilitated performance for words at the end of the list. And so this is referred to as the recency effect, and it's believed to be dependent upon short-term memory. And the idea is that the words at the end of the list are the last ones that we say right before the free recall test. And so they are still in short-term memory at the time of the test. And so they can be very quickly written down on that list. And in fact, researchers find that usually the first words that are written down are those words that are at the end of the list. So suggesting that they're in short-term memory and that people need to write them down quickly before they fade or decay from short-term memory, right? As we can only hold that information for a short period of time before we lose it. So we write it down first, and then we write down words from the beginning of the list that we are retrieving from long-term memory. And so we have worse performance for the words that appear at the middle of the list because they have not been transferred to long-term memory and they're not currently in short-term memory. Right? And so we can see the difference between facilitated recall that's due to long-term memory and facilitated recall that's due to short-term memory. with the serial position curve in this type of test. And we can vary the demands of the task to really tease apart short-term versus long-term memory. So for instance, if we have delayed recall, so rather than immediate recall, we memorize the list and then we are immediately given that blank piece of paper to write down as many words as we can recall. If instead we have a delay between the memorization and the recall test, this recency effect is further disrupted if during that delay there is a distraction. So just like we talked about, if you look up the phone number and then you walk across your apartment or your home and you're repeating that phone number over and over again, if someone asks you a question and distracts you, that disrupts short-term memory rehearsal or maintenance, and you forget that phone number. And so that's exactly what researchers find here, is that particularly if there is a distraction task during that delay period in between memorization and the recall test, that we have a disruption of that recency effect, that those words at the end of the list are pushed out of short-term memory during that distraction, and then they're not available during the recall test. But that distraction doesn't disrupt the primacy effect, because those words at the beginning of the list have already been transferred to long-term memory due to that repeated rehearsal. We can also see that if we give people more time, that this more time seems to facilitate performance for all of the words on the list, except for those that appear at the end, because again, that recency effect is dependent upon short-term memory. And when we see this facilitated performance for all of the other words, the words at the beginning and the middle of the list, was facilitating that with the slower presentation, the longer time to memorize, is that they have more time to repeat and rehearse and transfer that information to long-term memory. But for the words on the end of the list, that isn't necessary because we can maintain them in short-term memory. So all these seem to suggest that there is a distinction between short-term and long-term memory, and it helps us to understand how through repeated rehearsal we can transfer information from short-term to long-term memory. All right, so check out the last video for a discussion of short-term memory, better conceptualized as working memory, and a look at the frontal lobes, particularly the prefrontal cortex, the role that it plays in short-term or working memory.